Countries in every corner of the world are in debt. The current debt of the United States exceeds $38 trillion, the highest level in its history. The European Union's debt is approximately $14 trillion, while Japan's situation has nearly reached $9 trillion. Even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia or export giants like Germany and China have borrowed massive amounts. But here is the interesting part. If everyone is in debt, then who do they owe it to? This is a complex financial story where money, power, and history intertwine. And it is not as simple as it appears. Debt is not merely a burden. It is one of the foundation stones of the modern world. Every war, every crisis, every rise and fall takes shape upon this invisible scaffolding. If you examine the chain of creditors deeply enough, you discover an unsettling truth. The world does not owe a specific person. It owes itself. However, this does not mean that everyone benefits equally. To understand how we reach this point, where the planet is drowning in more than $315 trillion of debt, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy, we must go back to the very beginning. Centuries before the first credit card use or digital transfer, the idea of national debt was born not on Wall Street, but in war. In 1694, England was at war with France, and its gold resources were depleting. The king turned to merchants for help. In exchange for a continuous interest payment, backed by future taxes, they financed the crown. To manage this new arrangement, the Bank of England was established. This was revolutionary. The state could now spend money it did not yet possess. In return, the lenders received something priceless, a promise from the government that could be bought and sold. This was the birth of the government bond, the seed of the modern financial system. France copied it. The Netherlands refined it. The newly independent United States adopted it to finance its revolution and later its westward expansion. National debt became a measure of credibility, not a sign of failure. The ability to borrow was the ability to govern. While empires once conquered land to mine gold, they now issued bonds to earn interest. Battlefields have transformed into balance sheets. 3 centuries later, debt has become the world's most dominant export. The United States has $38 trillion in debt. Japan's debt exceeds $9 trillion. Global borrowing is increasing at a rate equivalent to $1 trillion every 100 days. Every country is a debtor. Every bank is a lender. Every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pensions, is both a debtor and a creditor. So who holds the other end of the rope? Let's start with the United States, because this debt is not just national, it is a global matter. Nearly half of this $38 trillion debt is public, meaning it is owed to investors, not to other branches of the government. Approximately 2/3 of these investors consist of American banks, pension funds, investment funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve. The remaining 1/3, roughly $9 trillion, belongs to foreign investors. Japan holds the largest share with approximately $1 trillion, followed by China with about $800 billion. These are followed by the UK, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Therefore, when people say the US owes China, it is true. However, this only applies to about 2% of the total debt. The vast majority of America's debt is actually owed to its own country. The Treasury issues bonds, and banks and funds purchase them. The Federal Reserve often buys these bonds back, creating new dollars in the process. Americans pay taxes that finance the interest on these bonds, and that money eventually flows back into American retirement accounts. It is a circular structure. The debt is real, but the creditors are mostly a reflection of the same system. And this circularity is not unique to America. It is a global phenomenon. Japan also lends. The US lends to Europe through Treasury bonds. At the same time, it provides financing to Europe through the IMF. Europe, in turn, lends to developing countries through the World Bank. Developing countries also lend to developed economies by using their foreign exchange reserves and Western bonds. This situation is like a global game of hot potato, but this potato consists entirely of promises. Every country holds the debt of another. Each promise is secured by another promise. It is just like a poker table, where every player borrows chips from the next. And the only rule that keeps this game alive is that no one leaves the table. But there is a fourth layer here, stronger than all of them: the markets themselves. Behind every government bond lies a network of institutions. There are hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks managing trillions of dollars in assets. These are the true arbiters of credit. They decide which countries can borrow cheaply and which must pay more just to survive. When they lose their confidence, currencies collapse, governments fall, and entire economies are reshaped overnight. While democracy decides who will govern, the markets decide who will survive. And the ultimate market maker is the central bank, the modern high priest of this system. Central banks do not just manage debt, they produce it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys a government bond, it creates new money in return. The liability of one balance sheet becomes the asset of another. Every dollar in circulation represents a unit of debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every banknote, and every digital dollar has an invisible promissory note etched onto its surface. For decades, this cycle has sustained itself through trust. As long as investors believe that governments will pay interest, and even that they might never pay back the principal, this machine keeps turning. We have experienced before what happens when trust is shaken. In 2010, the government in Greece became unable to pay its debt. Bondholders spiraled into a great panic, and interest rates skyrocketed. The European Central Bank and the IMF stepped in. However, these rescue operations came with austerity policies. A period filled with tax hikes, spending cuts, and mass unemployment began. For a generation, bailouts became the symbol of sacrifice. Constant defaults in Argentina turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, the government's inability to find foreign currency to pay off loans resulted in fuel shortages and total political collapse. When the system collapses, creditors suddenly emerge on the scene, the IMF rating agencies, and the anonymous bondholders who squeeze entire nations. But even after a collapse, the same cycle begins anew. New loans replace old debts. Old debts are restructured. The machine is reset with a new name on the same balance sheet, because in the 21st century, debt is designed not to be paid back, but to be rolled over. Nowadays, governments do not actually intend to pay off their debts, neither now nor in the future. This is not a conspiracy. It is a policy. When we take out a loan, we are expected to repay the principal. But for governments, the situation is different. Debt is viewed as a continuous subscription process, what economists call refinancing, by issuing new bonds to cover old debts. Interest becomes a real product, a rent paid for stability. The global economy is now dependent on this rent, like a shark that must swim constantly just to breathe. Today, the global financial system relies on trust, not repayment. The United States will never pay off its $38 trillion debt. It will refinance it forever. Japan has been continuously renewing its debt for decades, and this debt exceeds 250% of its GDP. Yet government bond yields remain near zero. Investors do not expect to get their money back. They hope to renew the deal. Why? Because for them, government debt is considered the safest collateral. A U.S. Treasury bond is seen not as a liability, but as an asset, the foundation of global markets. Pension funds hold it, banks use it as collateral, and central banks treat it as money. The system is built on governments never paying off their debts, because if they did, the world would lose its most reliable financial instrument. Imagine that Washington decided to pay back every penny of its debt. In that case, banks and funds around the world would suddenly lose their most reliable assets. The supply of dollars would drop dramatically, triggering deflation and collapse. Paying off the debt would destroy the very elements that keep the economy functioning. This is why governments do the exact opposite. They continue to take on more debt. And this happens not recklessly, but within a specific rhythm. Debt becomes the heartbeat of capitalism. It pulses like a heartbeat through every pension fund, mortgage, and market. This is why when politicians talk about balancing the budget or reducing the national debt, they are actually presenting an illusion. The goal is not to eliminate debt entirely. The goal is to make it sustainable, affordable, and attractive enough that the system never loses faith in it. Because when faith diminishes, numbers lose their meaning. Trust is shaken, interest rates rise, and an economy built entirely on continuous promises comes to a standstill. This is the true secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to pay it back. The plan was to make the world believe it would be paid back. It is a closed loop of trust. And as long as this trust persists, the numbers can stretch into infinity. However, trust is not distributed equally. When we say we owe it to ourselves, that is only partially true. Interest payments are not distributed equally across society. There is a flow from taxpayers and workers toward the institutions and investors who hold the debt. In other words, debt is not just a transfer between countries, it is also a transfer between classes. For this reason, global inequality and indebtedness increase by feeding off each other. The system rewards those who are in debt while punishing those who merely pay. If this sounds familiar, it's because the same story is being told on a larger scale. A cycle stretching from households to nations and from nations to the planet. Creditors are not the villains. Debtors are not the victims. They are two different faces of the same engine. The problem arises when the engine runs out of fuel, when new borrowing can no longer keep pace with previously made promises. That is when the question, who is the creditor, stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there isn't a single face to blame. Not China, not Wall Street, nor the IMF. They are all in it together. And we are part of this system too. The modern financial system has transformed debt into money. Governments issue debt, banks multiply it, investors trade with it, and citizens become dependent on it. The line between debtor and creditor has become so blurred that it is now unrecognizable. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it signifies balance. But if this balance is disrupted, if trust is shaken, the illusion ends, and we remember what debt truly means, a promise that cannot be kept forever. If this has given you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers, and I will show you where to look.